Our Bible word is Matthew 5 verses 3. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So our Bible words from the Beatitudes. But let us first go have a look at the context of the Gospel of Matthew. So let's have a look at the context of the Gospel of Matthew. And the issue the Gospel addresses is, who are the people of God? Even today, many people pose that question in terms of who are the true people of God. And the Gospel of Matthew, within its Jewish context, would have answered it, we, those, in other words, the followers of Christ, we are the true people of God. And the general things that the Gospel addresses can be summarized under the following three items. Number one is that God has reconstituted His covenant people. In other words, the covenant has been renewed. There's a new covenant people that has been established. Secondly, it's what's the correct way to interpret the law and the prophets. As we shall see later also, for this community for whom the gospel was written, Jesus was the new Moses. He was a true interpreter of the law. And thirdly, it also explains how Jesus was the agent, in other words, this Messiah who established the kingdom of God on the earth. And so the author of the gospel, he wants to say this is where true Judaism is to be found. It's those who follow Jesus. This was the fulfillment of God's purposes for Israel. That's to be found here. We are the authentic, true people of God. And he uses generally those three areas to explain this, how some things have changed. So we have to do here with an internal Jewish dialogue. It's between one group of Jews arguing against another group of Jews. Because this is now, the Gospel of Matthew is dated to somewhere between the 80s or 90 AD, more or less. And this was after the temple was destroyed. And of course, the Jewish world was in tatters because the temple has been destroyed. There's no more sacrifices, especially sacrifices of atonement. How do we live? How do we relate to God without the temple? Because God was especially present in the temple. So many Jews came together at Yamnia. These were priests, Pharisees, etc. And they came together and they said, we're now going to formulate this is Judaism. In view of what has happened after the destruction of the temple, this is the boundaries of true Judaism. And of course they were in conflict with Christians, Jewish Christians, followers of Jesus, who also said, no, we are true Judaism. This is where it will be found. And it was also here at Yamnia. This is where the incipient, or the beginnings of rabbinic Judaism started. They came together and of course they said, well, this is how we must live as Jews from now on. And also in their conflict with Christians, they added a special clause to a prayer. And it's also known as the Birchat Haminim. And benediction number 12 was probably added at Yamnia at this time. This is towards the end of the first century, around 85 AD, where now this benediction 12 read as follows: and for apostates let there be no hope. Of course, this is referring to Christians. It's referring to Sadducees, also reject the resurrection, etc. And may the insolent kingdom be quickly uprooted in our days. And may the Nazarenes, that's the followers of Jesus, and the heretics perish quickly, and may they be erased from the book of life. So we see here an internal debate, this internal conflict. It's one Jewish group under the rabbis or the incipient rabbinic movement. There's another group for these Jewish Christians. Now there's this argument, who are the true people of God? If we look at the authorship of the Gospel of Matthew, Of course, according to early church tradition, it was written by Matthew, the disciple of Jesus. And Eusebius also, he writes there that the disciple Matthew collected the sayings in the Hebrew language, and each one interpreted or translated them as he was able. Now it may well be that this Matthew wrote on collected sayings of Jesus. But most scholars today, they don't see this gospel as written by a Matthew the tax collector. This gospel was written by a scribe. He was written by a scholar of Jewish law. He was a very learned person. And because he quotes from the Septuagint, that in other words the Greek translation of the Old Testament, he also in other places quotes directly from the Hebrew, that he translates himself from Hebrew into Greek. And this author is also very interested in exactly the same issues as that the Pharisees and the scribes were interested in. The law, and how to interpret the law, how to apply the law in everyday life. And scholars also see, if you go read Matthew 13 verses 52, as a where the author, the evangelist who wrote this gospel, he makes a reference also to himself in a way, because it says there, therefore every scribe instructed concerning the kingdom of heaven. So scholars see, we see the author here. He's a scribe. He's instructed concerning the kingdom of heaven. He takes from the treasure things old and new, etc. So the author, a scribe, a learned person, very interested in the law and how to interpret the law. And as I said, it's dated to the 80s or 90s AD, and it appears that the audience who this gospel was written for found themselves in an urban environment. And because quite often the evangelist, where the Gospel of Mark as village, our author will replace village with city. And most scholars would suggest that the place where this was written was Antioch in Syria. Of course, where there was a very big and Christian community already established from the earliest times. So our author is also writing in the main for a Jewish audience, because this gospel has a very strong Jewish orientation. And our author, he emphasizes what's in continuity with the Old Covenant, but also what's new. So there's both discontinuities and continuities with the Old Covenant. In other words, the message of the New Testament. And also important for this community is Jesus is the new Moses. He is the new lawgiver. If you were a Jew in the first century, the law would have still remained a very important aspect of your identity. Because the law came from your ancestors. It was given through Moses. But now Jesus the Messiah has come. And he's the new Moses. He's the new lawgiver. And he's the one who gives the true interpretation of the law. So our evangelist, he sets out in the gospel an alternative way of being Jewish. In other words, where the true people of God are to be found, in conflict with other Jews who have not accepted Jesus as the Messiah. And we also see this tension because our author, he speaks of these other Jewish groups. And he refers to their synagogues. Right? Not our synagogues, their synagogues, where these other Jews come together who do not believe in Jesus. And he also makes mention of their scribes. So these other Jews who probably formed around this rabbinic movement that's growing, they have their synagogues and their scribes. And there's a Christian community, the Christian Jews over here, who also have their own synagogues, now their own congregations, and also their own scribes. So again, there's this conflict going on between the two communities. Also, the way the author explains Jesus being this new Moses. If you look at the Sermon on the Mount, on 6 occasions, Jesus contrasts old teaching with his own teaching. On 6 occasions, Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said." And then he says, but I say to you. And so Jesus, he's the new Moses. So that this contrast also makes this clear. And also in Deuteronomy, if we go to Deuteronomy 18, verses 15 to 18, we read there, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me, in other words, like Moses, from your midst, from your brethren. Him you shall hear. And that fulfillment of that we find in Matthew 17, verses 5. That is where Jesus is transfigured on the mount. While he was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them. And suddenly a voice came out of the cloud saying, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him. So we can see the instruction from Deuteronomy is been fulfilled or was encouraged in Matthew. Hear Jesus. He is this prophet like Moses that has been promised. And lastly, we can also mention the structure of Matthew. The structure of Matthew is built around 5 major discourses of Jesus. And every discourse of Jesus ends in the following manner, something like this. And so it was when Jesus had ended these sayings. And we find it there in end of chapter 7, beginning of chapter 11, etc., as you can see there on screen. And these indicate this is the end of a big discourse. And there are 5 of them. And they imitate the 5 books of Moses. In other words, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, etc. The first 5 books of Moses. And it's another way of saying, we have Jesus, the new Moses is among us. In addition to being the Son of God, the Messiah, a prophet, etc., he is the new Moses. He is the authentic. He is the true interpreter of the law. Not with the Pharisees, those rabbis there and their scribes. The true interpretation of God's will we find in this community, the community of Jesus and his followers. And of course, his 5 discourses, they are the Sermon on the Mount. That's the commissioning of the 12. That's where the 12 are sent out. There's the parables of the kingdom. That's the rules for church life and discipline. And there's also the Olivet discourse, where Jesus speaks of the future. So there are various ways our author writes about Jesus being this new Moses. Also, lastly, we can mention, in terms of the continuity between Jesus and the Old Covenant, our author often makes use of fulfillment formulas and Old Testament quotations. For example, often we find it on 10 occasions, we find the author writes that it might be fulfilled. For example, if we look at the virgin birth of Jesus, it says in chapter 1, verses 22, so all this was done that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the Lord to the prophet, saying, behold, the virgin shall be with child, etc. So on 10 occasions it makes use of this fulfillment formula, that it might be fulfilled. And also on 12 other occasions, the evangelist just puts in a quotation from the Old Testament, where Jesus fulfills Old Testament prophecy. For example, his birth in Bethlehem. There, our evangelist refers to Micah 5 verses 2. So, for the author, Jesus is the new Moses. This is the new covenant people. Jesus is God's agent. He's the Messiah. Jesus as the new Moses is the true interpreter of the law. He's the fulfillment of Israel's hopes. He's a fulfillment of prophecies and what the prophets had to say in the Old Testament. So this was a Jewish community. And they were struggling. They were being marginalized. They were being kicked out of the synagogues by their fellow Judeans because of their belief in Jesus as the Messiah. So Matthew, we also in the first discourse of Jesus, that's chapters 5 to 7 of Matthew. This is where Jesus, the new Moses, is inaugurating the teaching of the new covenant. This is the new Moses speaking to God's people, where explains the new law. But before Jesus gives the law of the new covenant, he first pronounces beatitudes over God's people. And beatitudes, different people translate it differently. Some will say, oh, the happiness of, we have blessed are. Technically, the Greek means how honorable are you. But it was basically a means to congratulate, to tell you, in a sense, well done, or you are in a good space for being where you are. And even, if it's in necessarily a bad position, but even so, you are going to be blessed. God's going to change things for you. So it's a good position where you find yourself. So at the beginning of the teaching of the new covenant, the law, Jesus pronounces these beatitudes first to God's people. Because remember, he is seated on a mountain in Galilee. It's probably a mountain just to the north of the Sea of Galilee. He is seated. That's the way a Jewish rabbi or teacher would teach his disciples. But the disciples of Jesus and a big crowd was present. So Jesus is in a sense inaugurating the teaching of the new covenant. But first he's pronouncing blessing on them, that they are honorable people. Because if you go to chapter 4, verses 20 or 4 verses 17, it says there, from that time Jesus began to preach and to say, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. So Jesus said, the kingdom of heaven is here. God's reign or God's rule is here with you. Things are going to change now. This is the good news. The good news is God's going to change things for you. Also through me, my ministry. So how are things going to change? What's the good news? And Jesus says it through these markerisms or these beatitudes that he addresses the people with. And so the beatitudes are specifically Matthew 5 verses 3 to 10. That's our immediate textual unit. And beatitudes was quite a common feature or a noticeable feature in Jewish writings. We don't find them in Roman writings or in Greek writings. In Jewish writings, you find them. For example, you find them in the Apocrypha, in the book of Tobit. You also find it in apocalyptic literature like 1 Enoch and 2 Enoch. You also find it in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I'm going to read some to you based on this translation of the Dead Sea Scrolls by Giza Vermeesh. And there's a document known in it as 4Q525. And I'm going to read you a little bit of these beatitudes that we find there. Okay, a part of the text is reconstructed, as you can see there on screen. That blessed is, it's probably the man or the person or those with a pure heart, and does not slander with his tongue. Blessed are those who hold to her, that's wisdom's precepts, and do not hold to the ways of iniquity. Blessed are those who rejoice in her, and do not burst forth in ways of folly. Blessed are those who seek her with pure hands, and do not pursue her with a treacherous heart. Blessed is the man who has attained wisdom, and walks in the law of the Most High. So these blessings is spoken on those who seek after wisdom. In other words, they observe the law of God. So the blessings, these beatitudes, we just don't find them in the Gospels. They're also part of other Jewish writings. And here we find many of these beatitudes. For example, our Bible word, blessed are the poor in spirit. Next, blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. So Jesus addresses those and say, well, you are in a good position. Good things are going to happen to you, even if they find themselves in a bad position, because God's going to change things for them. They are on the side of the right. They're on the side of those who will be vindicated. Those who are oppressed, they will be helped. That's why they are blessed. So like those markerisms or those beatitudes we've read here in Q, remember Q comes from the caves of Qumran. They were these Dead Sea Scrolls that were discovered. So just like that document where the blessings are pronounced over those who seek after wisdom, and that is to observe the law. Jesus also pronounces these beatitudes on different classes of people. We can group them in the following way. From verses 3 to 6, Jesus addresses those who are in a state of humiliation and subjection. They who long for God to put things right. And also verses 7 to 9, Jesus addressed those who are merciful, or the pure in heart, and the peacemakers. It's those who, even in difficulties, they show these personal qualities that they are God's people and faithful to God. And then verses 10 to 11, Jesus addresses those who experience persecution and who, despite persecution, remain faithful to Jesus and His teaching. So those are the three different groups, essentially, that Jesus addresses here in these Beatitudes. These are the people who He congratulates, so to speak, who are in a good place, even though they are suffering. But those first martyrisms, they are in a good place because God's going to overturn their suffering. God's going to help them. He's going to put things right for them. Now, if we focus on verse 3, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The poor in spirit, it also refers, the Greek word poor, it refers to those who actually beg. Their body position, their posture is like this. They beg, they ask for help, they are needy. It refers to those who are cowering, or bend over in that position. In other words, they are in a position of withdrawal, of anguish, of subjection, of suffering. So Jesus is saying, blessed are these destitute in spirit. They're like this. They are really in need, in anguish, and in suffering. Why are they blessed? What's going to happen to them? For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. In other words, God's care, God's reign is for you. God's special love and concern is for you. Things are going to be overturned. You are blessed. You are fortunate because you are going to be vindicated. The evil will be punished, but you will be vindicated, and you will become part of God's kingdom.